wanted to do as I thought about Chris's story, I wanted to bring in sort of a quote unquote special guest tonight. You may all know him as Trey. I know him as Trey. But what we know about Trey is that if there's anybody that loves Navy ships more than Navy sailors, it's Trey. So I went to Trey and I said, Trey, I'd love to know more about the USS Saratoga. I'm reading about it, but I also thought this might be a fun thing that you could sort of help us with. And I thought because when Chris joined and enlisted and then was assigned to this Saratoga, the Saratoga had been around for quite a while. So I thought maybe, Trey, you could give us a little bit of a history lesson about the Saratoga.
Yeah, no problem. So for anybody who doesn't know me, I'm Trey Burman. I am a high schooler. I'm 17, and a senior at the Key School. I am a volunteer on a Liberty ship in Baltimore, the SS John W. Brown. And I also am an amateur naval historian. So a little bit about the Saratoga. As mentioned before, she's quite large and had a lot of crew. She was the second ship of the Forrestal-class. So she in her own right was pretty revolutionary. The Forrestal was the first class of U.S. supercarriers that was like specially built for the modern world. The previous class, Midway, was converted. If anybody's been to San Diego and seen the big carrier, that's a museum now. Um, she was converted into a modern carrier, but if you look at an original commissioning picture of the Midway, you can really tell that she was a World War II carrier that was just able to be upgraded into a modern ship. The Forrestal class was the first class of aircraft carriers in the Navy to truly be designed from the ground up for jet operations, for modern heavy aircraft, and for long-term missions. She was steam powered, used steam turbines, which is different from what we think of what we think of with supercarriers now, which is nuclear power. But that was actually quite standard at the time. The Forrestal all the way through the Kitty Hawk class all were steam powered. And then Enterprise was kind of sandwiched in there as the first nuclear powered carrier. And then we transitioned over to the Nimitz. So Saratoga herself was commissioned in 1956. She was the second of four Forrestal class carriers. And her first couple of years of her career were pretty uneventful. She, very interestingly, she was kind of the favorite ship of Richard Nixon. He really liked riding around on her. So a lot of the times her deployments would be with Nixon on board sometimes, and he would be with the ship going across the Atlantic and meeting people. In the time-honored USS Forrestal class tradition, she did catch on fire pretty badly in 1961 off the coast of Athens. Killed 7 sailors, unfortunately. But it was treated, and the fire was treated. It was put out, and she went into dry dock, and she was repaired. And she's set up to sea. Her first deployment back, if anyone is familiar with U.S.-Israeli relations, she was actually one of the ships that responded to the USS Liberty incident. It was a U.S. surveillance ship that was attacked by Israeli fighters, and she was one of the ones called to assist with the rescue of sailors on board the ship. During this, she actually collided with what would eventually become a museum ship, the USS Little Rock. She was originally a Cleveland-class cruiser. But there was a situation. I believe the Saratoga tried to turn to port. The Little Rock also tried to turn to port, and they almost hit each other. But luckily, the Little Rock was able to stop in time to not hit the Saratoga. Through our early service life, she was pretty uneventful. Another important thing that she did do was she hosted a British FG-1 squadron in 1969. If anyone is unfamiliar with the designation FG-1, you might be more familiar with the F-4 Phantom. It is essentially just a British Phantom. They had different engines. But the British were trying to learn how to operate the Phantom off of carriers, and they used the Saratoga to kind of train their pilots before their Phantom-capable carriers are ready. She suffered pretty bad storm damage in 1967, which kind of kept her out of the height of the Vietnam War. She was in port for repairs, but she did deploy to Vietnam in 1972. She was stationed on the Tonkin Gulf 7 times throughout her Vietnam service, and she pretty much formed the backbone of the late Vietnam carrier fleet, along with Enterprise and the Kitty Hawk class carriers that were also there. Midway was, I believe, back in the U.S. at that point. Saratoga-based Phantom shot down 2 MiGs throughout the war and just Saratoga-based aircraft flew over 800 strike missions. 4 Saratoga-based aircraft were lost in Vietnam. I know of 1 F4, 1 A6, and 1 A7, and I couldn't find the 4th, but I found multiple sources that said 4 aircraft were lost. So we'll just have to assume the 4th was a Skyhawk or something that was on Saratoga at the time. After Vietnam, she was upgraded significantly. In the 1970s, S-3 Vikings and everyone's favorite, the F-14 Tomcat, were embarked on the Saratoga for the first time, and she was actually one of the first ships to undergo SLEP, which is the Service Life Extension Program. It became standard for most of the U.S.'s steam carriers at the time. Midway is very famously had a lot of changes made to her because of this. It was a 28-month refit program and was oftentimes considered by some naval historians. I don't really, but some other people do. They call it the most extensive refit program in history. I think that's a bit tall when you're looking at ships like the Midway, which their entire exterior appearance completely changed. But she did go through a 28-month refit, which is a pretty impressive upgrade program for the ship. She got completely new, pretty much everything. New radars, new missiles for air defense, essentially turning it into a modern carrier to keep up with the Nimitz class that was being introduced around the time. Now, her 80s career was actually, in my opinion, the most significant part of her service. And during her 1985 cruise, she was actually called to intercept in a 737. F-14s were called to intercept a Boeing 737 that was hijacked by, or not hijacked, but operated by a terrorist group, the Palestinian Liberation Front. Essentially what had happened is they had hijacked a cruise ship, the Achille Lauro. It was an Italian ocean liner. And what they said is, hey, we'll kill all these hostages that we have aboard the ship if you don't give us a 737 to extradite us back to Germany, where we can't be arrested. What ended up happening is they got on the 737, they got up, Saratoga F-14s came up by the 737, forced the plane to land in Italy, where Italian special forces apprehended the terrorists. So she played a pretty pivotal role in making sure that some bad people were brought to justice in that way. In 1986, just a year after, still on that deployment, she crossed Gaddafi's line of death with the rest of the U.S. Navy and conducted air operations over Libya. Tomcats from VF 103 were shot at, embarked on Saratoga, were shot at by SA-3s. And Saratoga-based Tomcats, I still don't know how. They somehow intercepted a pair of Libyan MiG-25s, which is a great feat for any aircraft because the MiG-25 is ridiculously fast and not good at pretty much anything else, but it was really fast. So there was an incident where they did intercept and turn back some MiG-25s from attacking the U.S. fleet. Strike aircraft from the Saratoga destroyed a Libyan warship and multiple anti-air radar posts as well, so she got to increase her combat performance, and she saw a good bit of combat throughout that deployment in 1980. So now we're kind of getting into the later parts of the Saratoga's career, and if there's anything that kind of describes the later parts to me, it's friendly fire, unfortunately. In 1987, a Saratoga-based Tomcat, I believe, shot down with an AIM-54, a U.S. F-4, one of the last F-4s in service. Somebody thought it was an enemy, and they shot at this F-4, and the F-4 got destroyed. Luckily, both pilots ejected, but the pilot piloting the Tomcat did end up getting grounded permanently. During Desert Storm, again, highlight of her career, Saratoga completed 6 transits of the Suez Canal during the war and conducted 11,000 launches and recovery throughout the war. So she was very active. Saddam Hussein actually claimed the Saratoga as destroyed multiple times in the age-old tradition of claiming U.S. carriers as destroyed when they actually aren't. But to be fair, a Scud was launched at the ship and missed by many miles. I believe that it was within the range of 50 miles around the ship, but it was aimed at the ship, is what we've deduced. Saratoga lost 2 aircraft during the war. An A-6 was shot down by a surface-to-air missile, and an F-18 was shot down, actually, presumably by a MiG-25 in an air-to-air engagement. So, unfortunately, the Saratoga did incur some losses. After the war, she stayed around for a little bit longer, doing a lot of training exercises, a lot of war games. And during one of these war games happened probably the darkest day of the Saratoga's career, in my opinion, which is the TCG Muavenet incident, which is essentially during a war game, the Saratoga, the captain of the Saratoga, decided that he wanted to test the Sea Sparrow missile, which is an anti-air missile, against a ship. And the idea was to launch a simulated missile, not an actual missile, just a simulated missile to see if it would hit, see if the guidance system would track. Unfortunately, through a mix-up of communication, something didn't go through. The operators of the Sea Sparrow actually shot 2 live missiles at this Turkish destroyer, the Muavenet, and hit her both times. So turns out you can actually destroy ships with surface-to-air missiles. I wouldn't recommend it, but you can, is what the Saratoga figured out. One hit the bridge of the Muavenet, killing 5 of the ship's officers, which happened to be some of the highest-ranking members of the Turkish Navy, so the Turkish were not very happy about that. And then the other hit the aft magazine and thankfully didn't detonate, which was very, very lucky. Interestingly enough, the enlisted sailors that launched the missiles were not punished, but the ship's commanding officer, James M. Drager, who was the person who ordered the attack in the first place, and the 4 officers who misinterpreted his orders were all were not court-martialed, but they were subjected to non-judicial punishment, and their careers were effectively ended. The Saratoga then was decommissioned in 1994, and she was scrapped in 2014. But during that time, she was actually, a lot of people were trying to preserve her, just like the JFK recently. People were trying to put her in Jacksonville, I believe. There was a huge push to put her in Jacksonville, Florida. But unfortunately, the city government was unsuccessful in raising funds because they had just acquired the Jacksonville Jaguars, and they needed a new stadium. So stadium beat aircraft carrier. Unfortunately, I think the aircraft carrier would have been cooler, but football is football. So that's the story of the Saratoga. Very brief. I could go in so much more detail about a lot of this ship. It's one of my favorite hidden gems of the Navy. Of course, she's unfortunately overshadowed by her World War II counterpart. But she's an extremely interesting ship, very long history, very similar to a lot of the other steam-powered carriers at the time. These multi-decade, like half-century histories that go into the early 2000s. So she's a very interesting ship. And you can really, really learn a lot from her history on how these, the older the ship, the more stories she has. So that's all I really have. Thank you for letting me talk about boats for 15 minutes, Sean, and I'll get back to you.
Trey,
Trey, I'm just going to bust in and say, Trey, next time, could you please come a little bit more prepared? I mean, do your homework, kid. Come on.
Trey, that was very impressive.
Absolutely amazing. Amazing.
Yeah, very, very impressive. Although I think it was closer to 12,000 launches, but the historians may have got that one wrong.
So you get an A minus.
You're rounding down, not up.
Yeah.
We all want to round up.
Right. Trey, I knew asking you would not be a mistake, and you did not disappoint. Thank you so much for that. And you can see in the chat, everyone really enjoyed it, and I did myself. And I'm sure, Chris, I always like to ask because it interests me, and in working with the